Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our regular Monday stream.
Hello,
Hello,
we're back.
we're back. This is one we're supposed to do on Wednesday, but you were rather ill, and I ended up being rather busy that day anyway. So,
Yeah.
we do try and do these when we can. It's weird that the Monday stream has become the regular stream day. The
Yes.
Wednesday streams, we do try to do them. They do sometimes fall by the wayside. But generally, we will be streaming if we can on Mondays and Wednesdays, and hopefully there's more to come out on the Substack.
Yeah, I mean, we're sort of topics galore at the moment, so we won't be running out of things to do, but I don't know. There's just times where either you are busy or we're not fully available or not in the best nick, and just therefore would rather not sort of do a stream for the sake of it. I think we'd much rather at least try to provide some kind of quality, even if it is a slightly looser stream like the one this evening might be.
We'll see how it goes, but I don't think it's a particularly. We still have a.
I mean, loose for our
I
standards.
guess, yeah. I guess we don't have like actually rigid, like properly rigid script like we sometimes do. But it's really a follow-on from last week's stream. This week. But before we get too far into that, thank you everyone who's shown up. I do notice some returning members. Thank you, Anthony Keane. Thank you, Not Sure. Thank you, Vladimir. I can never say it. It's got lots of accents on it. And I think I saw Chancellor Chief, and I think has been a member before. I'm not sure. They're certainly a long-time supporter of the channel. So thank you
Yes.
to everyone who regularly views these streams.
Well, it
But
is just very simply the fact that if you support the streams and you share the stuff and you support us directly in some sort of manner, we have more of an incentive to do more stuff, or at least better stuff, in the same period of time. I
yes,
think for us to be doing any more than we otherwise do just now just cannot be justified by the fact that there is very marginal returns. And a
yeah,
lot of
we
it's kind of just done as a passion project because no one else would talk about the things we talk about.
we try to do these regardless, but it does help having some kind of cushion with it since there is a large amount of research associated
There are.
with every one of these streams, and we
It's.
do try and put our stream notes out in the pinned comment below every video. If you're watching this on the VOD, it will be already there. I've been a bit lax over the past few months, but I do try and put them on basically after we finished now.
Yes.
Um, Usually, when you hear the regular music at the end, which has become a bit of a thing now, that's the period where I'm getting the stream
But
notes on.
in short, we have the super chats and the super stickers and the Substack if you want to read and support the stuff on there. And also, if you want to dodge the taxman but don't tell him, you can give directly to us via PayPal, which is the pinned comment in the chat.
Well, it's really dodging the YouTube tax man. To be
Oh,
fair,
oh yeah.
Shh, uh, is what it is. We're trying to dodge the YouTube tax with that, but that's kind of the preamble. By the way, it's still up and down, hot and humid here, as we always talk about the weather in England. It is a very
I think today's the coolest it has been for quite a while.
yes, it's
It's
very
still muggy, but
very common pastime in Britain is discussing the weather. But it's that's kind of by the by. I'm trying to think. Again, it's not a direct follow on, but if you did miss it last week, do go on and watch our Brexit and sovereignty stream. Since it seems to have been hidden from a few folk, I had a few folk mention they didn't get any notifications for it because
mm,
it seems that YouTube is a bit up and down for actually serving our content. We seem to get streams that get like 4,000 views without really being linked by anyone or anything exceptional happening, and yet a similar stream will get like 2,000 views a week later.
yeah.
And it just seems to be where we are very much on the winds, not only of the algorithm, but what YouTube decides to show our own subscribers.
Yes.
So it is worth checking back on the main page because I do know a lot of people do not get served these. But again, that's quite enough preamble. I'm not quite sure. I've looked for variations on the formula to see if people have talked about this. They kind of have, but not in the same terms.
Mm.
Today we'll be talking about a concept I just refer to as performative failure, but I think we'll probably have some other snazzy names other places.
Well, it's sort of somewhat similar to the kind of idea we've talked about from Gottfried, which is that, he specifically talks about the context of the American state and that the American state will purport to be powerless in a situation and acting at the behest of two or three dozen different sort of interest groups, and therefore its hands are tied, and it's everyone else that's being political.
Yes. We talked last week in the stream about kind of where sovereignty is. Not having a place where sovereignty resides, or being able to hide the sovereignty, is a great way of enabling something like this.
Yes.
Because when there is an action of performative failure, you're able to point out many of the other quote unquote neutral organs of state that are preventing this or holding it up, or as you described last week, oh, we're asking more questions, we're trying to do it right, and things end up in political limbo for many, many years.
You've got as the brief little sort of introduction passage here. The most immediate power of the managerial bureaucracy itself is inaction. Over and above the deliberate acts, there is also a powerful and very purposeful inertia within UK public bodies that means aligned efforts is needed to shift any course. If you can think about it in this sense, one would need the entire civil service on board to tackle immigration properly.
Yes.
Yet it only takes one leaker in the Home Office to upend deportations nationwide.
Yeah, it is. It's what you mentioned last week, really, which I think was a great little stem here, in that the major power of a bureaucracy, even without being given orders, is to gum everything up.
Yes.
The point of the separations of power is that the separation of power doesn't work. And it doesn't work without behind the scenes inter-elite action. That's how it's meant to work.
Yeah, it's almost sort of like in a completely inverse sense from how we would understand politics a century ago. The sovereign is not he who acts in the most decisive fashion, but he who chooses to act in the most indecisive sort of fashion.
Well, I don't know. There's probably an old adage somewhere that says if you want something not to be done, ask the local council to do it.
Or the Tory party.
Yeah, yes. Or the Tory party. But yeah, there's a lot of jokes about that in things like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and a lot of stuff from the 70s and 80s is very much based on ribbing that. I do actually mention an example of British Leyland further down. I don't have a link for it, but I guess we rely on quite a lot of prior knowledge from people, because if you're an American Zoomer, you have no clue what British Leyland was.
And that's probably a good thing.
And that's probably a good thing. And if you don't know what British Leyland was, look up its history, because you will actually learn a lot about bureaucracy.
Yes.
And also a lot about nationalised industry. A lot of the kind of quote-unquote red pills that you get as a normal reader of history just come from events like that. Because that's one of the things I remember researching. And to be fair, there's a lot of people who've said that they got onto the whole sniffing out bureaucracy game because they saw that very good feature on Top Gear, actually, about British Leyland, which is with considering the time they had and the type of show they are, was actually an excellent feature. But that's kind of by the by. I do have a little bit of an intro. I like to do my my little intros here before we get too far into it. So the main question would be, how do you separate performative failure from just failure? And the main point is that from an outside perspective, you can't. It's kind of the point. If you aren't able to pick apart the process, then you can't. And the only people with access to the details of the process and the sole ability to filter access to them are those in power that are enacting them. So it's both it's a hen, it's the chicken coop and the fox.
Well, you could sort of say that it's the case of trying to argue, well, did the GOP in the American election in 2020 allow what happened when it came to the steal?
Yes.
Or did the steal happen despite their efforts?
The main point is, effect-wise, it doesn't really matter.
In a lot of senses, yes, but I think as we'll show through some of the examples we've got, there is at some point where you come across so many otherwise undeniable facts.
Yes.
And so many other capabilities that a body can achieve that it must have chosen not to succeed.
Well, it's also a point as well that it's, as I said here, this is what makes it such a powerful trick, especially when done in a bipartisan manner. The illusion of the importance of sovereignty of political parties once elected to office is largely dispensed with in favour of appealing to neutral technocratic dispensed with in favour of appealing to neutral technocrats staffing independent bodies. These have become the arbiters of what is and isn't possible, sensible, ethical, legal, and environmentally sound.
Yes.
There's a lot of this that happens in you'll see it throughout the government, basically from 2010 onwards. It's very much a feature of the late Blair years, aka the Brown years, and also David Cameron's time in government. And we mentioned the history point of the bonfire of the Quangos quite a
Yes.
few weeks ago.
I mean, I could just add to that as well. The last little point I've got here, unless we've got that there. Never mind. These ideas in UK governments since the Blair years of stakeholders, public-private partnerships, and all filtered through what were once called quangos, but are now divided up into a patchwork of arm's length public bodies, NGOs, private businesses whose sole customers are the UK government and global charities. Think of your Serco as the prime example there. And this is, I think, the further important point that really grasps what we're getting at here. By allowing non-elected bodies to handle problems in society, we are told it is non-political. Until, of course, said body acts against the will of higher bodies, at which point its action becomes explicitly political and must be shut down. Failure in the non-political is acceptable and more often than not preferred. Success in the political cannot be accepted. As a matter of fact, it must be stopped. Think back to the heroes in the Supreme Court who upended Brexit. I mean, it's such a perfect example of it.
Yes.
The Supreme Court, an explicitly political body established by Tony Blair at the dying days of his regime as a sort of way to throw a whole, never mind the spanner, but the whole bag of tools into any large law change that was ever going to happen in the UK.
Yeah.
And if any one element of that, some Equality Act or anything like that the Conservative Party, in theory, wanted to put through, the Supreme Court could have put their hand up and said, what you're doing is political. Stop that. We need to vote on this.
Well, we could also see possible future instances, which I don't want to get into too much legal precedent stuff here, but when we see it acting as a quote-unquote constitutional court, what the New Britain stuff will do, and the New Britain logo will be on the lower third in a moment, but what we see with the New Britain stuff is that the Supreme Court will be effectively tasked with keeping essential legislation that is constitutionally important to Britain. That's why that language was so important. You could have a situation in, say, 10 years' time where you would get a government that was elected of slight outsiders or people who aren't quite the same like Whitehall mandarins as most people are, who attempt to repeal something like the Equality Act, and they'll be told by the Supreme Court that they can't because it is a constitutionally essential piece of legislation.
Yeah, I do see someone in the comment there saying performative failure right up there with failing upwards. Well, yes, think of the concept of performative failure as entire bodies, either political, expressly or unpolitical, private or public, full of staff that are all continually failing upwards.
Yes.
And they understand that that's how the incentive structure isn't expressly stated, but that's how it otherwise functions.
Very much so. Here's a little kind of lead-in from last time, which is the idea of regulatory alignment. This, I think, was the largest piece of performative failure that took place during the quote-unquote Brexit negotiations, which was the wholesale surrender of the replacement of UK legislation within the withdrawal agreement and its copying into UK law, which will never be unpicked.
No.
It is one of the biggest acts of handover of power that has ever been done, and it was done in the name of getting Brexit done.
I mean, I find it quite funny in the last couple of days, one Matt Godwin, who we'll talk about in a couple of weeks at some point, because he's got some interesting roles. But he's tweeted out a number of times, Brexit brought sovereignty back. Brexit was a result of popular sovereignty, this, that, and the next thing. When we know fair well, during the course of Brexit, irrespective of whether or not the vote was counted up accurately, who really gives a shit?
Yeah, who cares?
What we know is our elites took that mandate, and air quotes, and used it to make sure that there was no law in the UK. There is no connection to God, nor crown, nor even really man in any sort of republican sense.
No.
There is no supreme body. And this is almost like the perfect scope for an infinite amount of performative failure, because at the end of the day, nobody's accountable because there's no body at the top that makes everyone accountable.
Well, this is a page on the .gov website. We actually spend a lot of time just on the .gov website, really. This is them talking about guidance to public bodies. This is from the Cabinet Office. And a lot of this stuff we use because, yes, it is public facing, but it is also meant to be intra-elite.
Yes.
You are meant to read parts of these as a minister, and this will be intensely boring to most members of the public that it will just not be read. In fact, we have said many times that being boring is partially how this has all gotten away with.
Yes.
Because people just can't be asked picking through the bureaucracy, how a lot of stuff gets hidden. But they talk about, again, confusing people about where all initiatives come from or who is actually implementing what. Arm's length bodies are a specific category of central government public bodies that are administratively classified by the Cabinet Office. There are 3 types of arm's length bodies. They talk about executive agencies, which are things like the DVLA, the Met Office,
HMRC.
HMRC. Sorry, HMRC is a different one. Sorry,
is it?
That's the HM Prison and Probation Service.
No, but with HMRC, not. Oh no, HMRC. Sorry, it's a non-ministerial department.
Again, it's deliberately very confusing. But the upshot of all of these types of things: the Food Standards Agency, HM Revenue and Customs, Ofgem, which is the energy regulator, Ofcom would also come into that.
Look at the middle one here. A non-departmental public body is a body which has a role in the process of national government, but is not a government department, or part of one, and which accordingly operates to a greater or lesser extent at arm's length from ministers.
So it doesn't mean anything.
So it's this thing, except from when it's not that thing, because it's really another, and it also exists between a spectrum of all the other ones.
If this isn't making sense, it's because it isn't supposed to.
Yes.
Again, this is a large part of how the performative failure works, in that you have performative failure, but you cannot pinpoint where it comes from because of the sovereignty issue and because of the deliberate rat's nest that is how the British government operates things.
One thing I will say, though, that is interesting with these is that the bottom one here that's made to seem as if it has very little importance is one of the only ones, I think, within here that really is able to declare its own rules in a lot of ways. Non-ministerial department is a government department in its own right, but it does not have its own minister. However, it is accountable to Parliament through its sponsoring ministers. A non-ministerial department is staffed by civil servants and usually has its own estimate and accounts. So, in that sense there, what they're talking about is a wholly unelected body that is commissioned by ministers who sponsor it but aren't wholly responsible for it.
Yes.
And can then actually almost sort of declare its own rules to a certain extent. Whereas your sort of different elements of councils, Environment Agency, Health and Safety, DVLA, HM Pres, Met Office, these take policy from Parliament. The non-ministerial departments are, but I think, about the only one that would actually give policy to Parliament.
We'll come to it later, but any part of this machine, the problem is that all of these bodies were affected by what we talked about last time, which is Brexit.
Yes.
And so any of them could hold up the process or be used as an excuse to hold up the process. And there are so many different tendrils and so many different mechanisms through which to undertake performative failure. It's quite staggering that anything gets done, which is the point. That's the whole point. But we're trying to explain to you, really, without belaboring the point too much, quite how much of an arm's length illusion there is here, that these are non-political neutral bodies, and therefore their failure is a non-political neutral failure. Yes. And it means that the best, with the best intentions, whatever they're saying cannot be done because they are not political. And we will see that when it is suggested they are political, ministers are slapped down very fast and many apologies get given very quickly.
As a slight aside, this is also partially the reason why we don't always just buy into the incompetence narrative.
Yeah.
If you watch, obviously, our one on the skills collapse, there is definitely an extent to which people are less skilled at a whole number of things in the way that otherwise normal people used to be 20, 40, 60 years ago. However, the regime itself, I don't always buy the incompetence argument because it's very easy to say, hand in hand, this is some body that just has a bunch of civil service people, and the reason why they constantly fail at policing immigration is because they're stupid and they can't do their jobs.
Well, yes, the opposite of performative failure is, I don't know, what I would consider like unattributed success.
Yes.
It's things that are doing very well, being administered overzealously that no one quite seems to be responsible for. We talked about that during the demobilization stream and about how local councils are being used as vectors for global power. But that's another thing, that you will have a large amount of unpopular measures that are being enacted that come from nowhere. Nobody wants them, nobody's responsible for them, and yet everybody's doing them. And the role of independent bodies in climate governance, the UK's Committee on Climate Change, has, again, I don't want to read the full report, but it really is talking about that stuff. It's talking about the fact that despite it being a very unpopular political project, and really explicitly saying that all of these bodies can act together to effectively force a UK government to act against its supposedly sacred political mandate by the electorate to implement what needs to be done in a neutral sense through climate change. This is the unpopular success that can't quite be attributed.
Yes, and what it also does as well is it's like a new stitch that's got to be unpicked for every other preceding law. Any law that comes after this, does that now comply with the requirements of the 2016 Energy Act, which then precedes a whole other realm of debate and arbitration, as you would like to say, that could lead to a situation where you have even further performative failure.
It's, again, Kafka could never imagined a bureaucracy this unwieldy. It is not comical and it is not silly because it serves a purpose. And again, the most liberating thing about studying this is realizing that most of it is not real. This is not actually how government operates.
No.
It will never be how government operates. And a lot of people get very confused and scared by looking at these things because they think, oh God, no one's actually in charge. People are actually in charge. You're just really not supposed to see who they are.
Yes.
It's very obvious when you encounter both sides of this equation, really. But here's one of them. That there was this period of the civil...
God, just the internal civil service magazine, civil service world.
Well, basically, yes. There's so many of them, they have their own publications. But they say this is how the sausage gets made. It's all so tedious. No, it's this is not actually how the sausage gets made.
This is how, exactly. This is how the sausage gets unmade.
Yes.
Accusations that civil servants are resisting attempts at post-Brexit reform are crass and damaging to morale, the government's former top lawyer has said. After Attorney General Suella Braverman said ministers were having to fight against officials' Remain bias. But you're the party elected with a 70-seat majority. Why do you need to be concerned with a bunch of civil servants running around with a Remain bias if you're supposed to be the people in power?
The bureaucracy is obviously very opposed to any level of even surface kind of deglobalization, even the window dressing of it. And acknowledging that the civil service is staffed by career managerialists who regard the British populace in the same way a child with a magnifying glass regards an ant colony is not allowable. The illusion of the neutral must be maintained.
Yeah, because that's what this Becky Smith character is saying. Isn't so much that, oh, you're wrong to suggest that we are all Remainers. It's more, how would that impact what we do in our job as neutral, honest civil servants?
That's damaging to morale. It's described as a jibe, crass, damaging to morale. No one anywhere in this says it's untrue.
What's the conclusion for this article? Is it just like complete nonsense?
It's talking about Braverman caught the attention of children's book author
Michael Rosen.
Yeah.
Nice.
Responding to the Bravermans, there's no real conclusion here, which is why I don't want to read the article.
Oh, fair enough.
But it's more just a rebuke, and it's like a list of David Penman and Michael, basically being rebuked.
Who can think of any government anywhere, anytime attacking its own bureaucracy and/or professionals in order to appeal over them in order to win allegiance from the public or the people? I mean, that's almost like an interesting kind of point because that's him doing the Gottfried thing but backwards.
Yeah, he's doing that's very funny. Now they must be the priests in this situation. You cannot directly appeal to the people because, as we said last week,
the people were wrong on this one.
Yeah, also the people do not hold sovereignty.
No.
They're supposed to. Oops.
Sorry.
But our democracy is is held up by all these different institutions, and directly appealing to the people apparently is not part of our democracy. But there's another one here just from Holyrood magazine. Again, this is a one that's made for essentially Holyrood insiders. UK Minister Steve Baker apologises for suggesting civil servants are trying to sabotage Brexit. Steve Minster has performed a climb down amid calls for Theresa May to sack him for making the claim in the House of Commons. Again, these are two different ministers. I don't think Solomon Braidman apologised, but the entire thing was dropped, and this Steve Baker character ended up apologising. But it's laughably clear to everyone involved that the civil service does not want these things to happen, and is at every turn.
Scroll down for a second there. What they say, yeah. Meanwhile, Cabinet Secretary Sir Jeremy Haywood appeared to take a swipe at Baker on Twitter by praising the work that civil servants do to help ministers form evidence-based policy.
There we go.
Every day, their great work supports the government in making evidence-based policy and helps deliver better public services across the country. It's non-political, Mr. Baker.
Welcome to the consent factory.
Yes.
But again, the civil service is the place where you see the largest amount of performative failure.
Sorry, look at that one above that there as well. Dave Penman, this is the same one from earlier on. The Prime Minister should be questioning whether she has the confidence in Steve Baker's ability to separate his ideological position with his responsibilities as a minister.
Yes, Brexit itself is an ideological position.
And that's what I mean by the expressly political cannot be allowed to succeed.
No. Brexit is a political project, and it must be held up by the neutral civil servants. They're merely doing their jobs. There's a whole bunch of stuff here. I just wanted to quickly point out that Brexit was also a thorn in the side of EU bureaucracy, and that in the neutral interpretation is supposed to be implementing policy, but has repeatedly been used as a form of punishment. The whole thing about the will they, won't they, with the border.
It's like we've got the worst of both worlds. We have the EU laws, but we can't even really say that we're part of the sort of body that allows you to hold them to account. Not that was ever really possible anyway.
No.
Even in terms of, in their eyes, that's no longer true either.
It's weird. Everything seems to have gone to a left to right alignment overnight and completely buggered up how we display these. But I shall soldier on, as I apparently have to leave it in this weird configuration that makes half of websites look strange. Websites being served to desktops is just miserable now. It is. We talk about it every time, but it is so bad and it is so uneven. But yeah, some lorries bringing goods from the EU to the UK have been stuck at the border for 4 days as logistics bosses blame disruption on terrible new Brexit red tape. What we found was there were some failures of computer systems, there were some French strikes, and generally the system was operating as it was before, but there was a large amount of pain manufacturing in just getting goods in and out of Britain from France over the issue of Brexit. And again, that is another aspect of performative failure, that it can be used as part of an ideological framing. Something has failed, something has been made to fail, and someone must be blamed for it. And with the filtering of the media especially, it is very easy to attach acts of performative failure to ideological projects.
Yes, it's the same sort of post hoc ideology washing that we see from the regime when it does something it wants to. And it sort of does something and then after the fact says, well, we did this for you because it makes you more free.
Well, here's one from Euronews in which they acknowledged there was a poll that said that EU citizens believe that the UK is being punished for Brexit. This is Germany 37%, less cordial, blah, blah, blah. But really, it's talking about the fact that people are regurgitating the EU's own propaganda to them in the forms of polling. It's very clear to me that EU citizens, and especially EU bureaucrats, have been given a clear communication that the EU is being punished for leaving. Sorry, the UK is being punished for leaving the EU. And it's even clearer when it gets to... here's a Politico article just called "Europe has learned nothing from Brexit. Brussels is blind to the economics, the threat the UK could become." It's basically somebody doing a bit of cope and being like, Britain can still do it. But they go into the fact that it's Yeah, it's very clear that EU bureaucrats have been given a large amount of memos that will tell them that yes, we
Well,
are punishing Britain for leaving the EU.
alas, as the first anniversary of Brexit approaches, it is clear that the EU has learned every wrong lesson from the divorce. Riled by the deliberately provocative actions of successive British governments since 2016, the EU has been unable to separate the UK's bark from its bite. And the danger this poses is swiftly growing.
Again, it's them appealing to the neutral position. It's like, oh, Britain has been deliberately provocative, and therefore the EU feels forced to respond.
Yeah, this is an approach that has been strengthened by the pandemic, which has allowed the EU to subsume Brexit within a broader reimagining of a more relevant, more assertive, more global union.
Well, I just wanted to bring this one up because one, it's got a lot of the appeal to neutral language in it.
Yes.
And two, it just mentions offhand the fact that, oh yeah, the Britain and the future of the Anglo-EU relationship struggle to elicit a single reference or positive soundbite. That there is a very clear bitterness in Europe about the entire project, that they feel like they are being forced to undertake somewhat unnecessarily. I think a lot of EU bureaucrats, you see it in the language that they use, quietly know there's going to be some form of rejoin at some point. And they see this whole project, one, as an unnecessary headache for themselves, but two, as a chance to make it clear that any other country that attempts to go this way will be just completely gummed up by it. That they will end up in a situation where all the projects they try to negotiate in earnest from an outside point of view will fall to nothing because they are being punished. And they're being punished in acts of performative failure.
And at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, there cannot be an effective, strong American empire and an effective, strong European empire. So the whole thing will become subsumed in agreements with the World Health Organization, agreements with the World Bank, agreements with the IMF, agreements with the UN, and all these different charters and this, that, and the next thing that essentially form the secret background international law that nations deal with each other in.
Well, there's always the naive interpretation, which is an undercurrent in all of these, in that the civil service is flawed and that it just can't imagine a world without the EU. It can't imagine a UK without EU law. They lack, the political parameters in their minds to imagine political projects that violate their own principles.
I can see a little bit of that insofar as you could argue that so many of them are maybe so used to defaulting to what's the EU law in this? Well, there's already an EU law for that anyway, so we don't need to make one up. And this has possibly been the answer in so many sort of branches of the civil service since like the late 90s, early 2000s as well. The EU's already tackled that, or the EU's tackling that. So we'll wait for them to put out their policy and then we'll just enact that.
It's also clear that that isn't the case.
No, of course it's not entirely, but again, within their worldview, I could somewhat understand why someone who worked for the civil service who did that all day would genuinely not understand. Well, how do we come up with our own laws?
Well, that is the kind of neutral default. That is the illusion. Even without Machiavellian action, that is the power of the neutral position, of the default position. But it's very clear that it goes beyond that, especially when it comes to the civil service. It's clear that what was said about them is true, and yet people had to apologize for saying it, which makes it even funnier and makes it even more suspicious. But I'll read
the little point you've got here first. Media campaigns have been constant. No other specific issue from 7 years ago has seen constant presence in the news cycle. This is important as the media chooses to simply accept most changes and portray them as neutral reality. You must resist Brexit in the same way that Trumpism and populism must be resisted. Can
you imagine what could be done as a political project if the Daily Mail just would not shut up about the Equality Act?
Yes.
And had, for the last 13 years, railed against the provisions of the Equality Act so that the average Daily Mail reader was both fluent in them and knew exactly what the problem was if they'd been paying attention. That had been an incredibly powerful thing to do. And it's what we do with having the through line of, we will usually mention specific pieces of legislation dozens of times. Things when we did a specific stream on the Covert Human Intelligence Sources Act. I think I've got that one right this time. Or we'll talk about the policing bill, or we do talk about the Equality Act. We talk about the Supreme Court and the bringing of it out of thin air in 2010. All of these are running themes we try and drill into our audience because they are very important aspects of British politics and what are supposed to be the neutral British laws that exist forever, that are both recent and have caused radical change that we simply do not talk about and are never talked about, even within supposedly alternative media. And that's really the role that the media arm does. They have constantly bombarded people with these stories of performative failure. This is the purpose of it, is to create this large evidence base in people's minds. And that's why I wrote the whole Brexit has failed thing, because they are the ones in charge of the machinery. They are able to generate the friction, and they're able to use the friction to create propaganda. And that is why they're really telegraphing with polls and constant stories about the fact that Britons want to rejoin the EU. That is one of the largest threads, I think, of the last 4 years at least, and that there's these constant polls saying if there was a second referendum held today, Remain would win.
What are the odds?
Yeah.
Fourth down on the most viewed there. Government scheme to send asylum seekers to Rwanda will cost £169,000 per person, Home Office says.
Well, we'll be talking about that.
No, I know, it's just the fact that it's there on the side.
Well, I was going to have a quick discussion really about the way bureaucracies tend to try and resist steering by threatening detonation.
Yes.
There's been a lot of that. We saw a lot of that with the lorries. We've seen a lot of that with some of the immigration stuff too, as we'll get onto. But it's a lot of them will go for the nuclear option, in that you'll see sometimes that ministers will essentially, or whole departments will threaten to quit en masse if there is an attempt to reform or steer them that is not considered within their remit or is not part of the neutral charter.
I can remember all these different sort of scare story headlines during COVID about Brexit law that hasn't been solved means Britain will run out of food in 2 weeks, or will run out of ibuprofen, or will run out of antibiotics. However, the one success that is praised from Brexit is that because we were outside of the EU, we were able to develop vaccines quicker.
Yes, that is one of the... that's a tangible benefit of Brexit.
But you should mention here as well that you can look at, say, the really extreme example, which is the unions acting against organisations like British Leyland and essentially suggesting to them, well, you can either wholly accept all of our demands, or we will hold every single one of your employees under pressure to strike till the whole company folds.
Yes.
And the folding in that instance would mean the continued expense of hundreds of millions of pounds of government money to keep British Leyland afloat.
It's very clear as well that these departments would rather fold, they would rather detonate themselves in service of preventing projects they do not wish to see happen than to go along with them, than to aid them. It is it's a very powerful lever to pull, in that if you find yourself in conflict with the civil service, it will essentially set services on fire, as seen in the NHS. The NHS will quite literally just kill people to get their own way. And that's what NHS strikes are. That's what the movement of care priorities was during the lockdowns. That was them just killing people.
But in the same vein, if you, as someone who is licensed under the British sort of nursing board, I can't remember the exact name for it just now, if you and the people you work with try and strike without their go-ahead, instantly fired.
Yes.
Because you are going against your sort of duty of care to a degree that your license is stripped away from you. But vice versa, if you don't strike when they want you to, the duty of care consideration goes out the window, and now you're a traitor.
Thank you for the £4.50 JP through the PayPal. Great streams. Be happy. Thank you very much. Again, there's a few different ways to donate, but we've already been through our shilling and we'll probably go through at the end. So I'll keep going. The other big aspect we've seen in the last 5 years, especially, of performative failure has been the immigration question.
Yeah,
because the immigration question is really it is the most unpopular settled issue. There's been a lot of coverage this week about, what is it, 75 years of the Windrush. The Windrush is always portrayed as the starting point of multicultural Britain, as when Britain graduates from its imperial history and becomes a host nation, we become the virtuous hosts.
Well, I think of it in this way. Performative failure is the strategy by which the regime leaves unpopular problems unsolved.
Yes.
I think that's maybe the best way I can explain it in short.
It also leaves unpopular problems unsolved until it can portray them in time as popular events and popular initiatives. That's what Windrush was. As we've talked about before, it was an incredibly unpopular thing that happened. Even within government, a lot of the politicians struggled to stomach it, but they were told by their internationalist paymasters that they just have to accept it, and that's just what Britain was now. And well, you had the empire, so what do you expect, kind of stuff. And it was incredibly unpopular in Britain. It was part of the birth of what would become things like the National Front. People were alarmed by the fact that large boatfuls of people without visas could simply just come into Britain and not be removed. It was a scandal at the time, but it is portrayed as a wondrous piece of British history now. And all that has changed is that most people who remember how it was responded to are dead. And that's always how this happens. But again, that was another piece of performative failure, to the point that it came back round in that the deportation of some of those people many years later became
hostile environment thing,
the
which
Windrush
was
scandal.
A political success that shouldn't have been allowed to happen.
Yes. Here we go again. There's a great one from YouGov here. I believe this is from 2012 by Peter Kellner, president of YouGov at the time. But there is some extraordinary stuff in here. It's called The Perilous Politics of Immigration. It goes on to say, basically, that 70% to 80% of British people do not want immigration, basically at all. They try and break it down by, legal immigration, this, that, reduce net immigration to zero. 70%.
Was that 73% of people agreed with the idea that Britain is already overcrowded?
Yes.
All the way back in 2012. That's
70% of people wanted in 2012 net migration to reduce to zero. That had actually fallen, I believe, from 75% in 2010, the height of the BNP at that point. It talks about, you break it down very fairly. So I'm like, how unlikely do you think it is that David Cameron will be able to deliver the pledge to reduce net migration into Britain from hundreds of thousands a year to tens of thousands? You must remember that was the promise at the time.
Scroll down to the parrot. This in turn helps to explain why the Tories are struggling to turn immigration into a decisive vote winner, despite their tough language and the firm stance adopted by Theresa May, the Home Secretary. Consider these figures. Which party do you think would handle the problem of immigration best? Well, Conservative seems to be the majority there, but I presume...
Look at that's 2010.
Yeah.
And that's 2012.
I was going to say that the spread grows as you go from June into the following December 2 years later, because across that period, people probably realised what the bloody trick was.
What happened was the David Cameron government initiated an exercise of performative failure, in which they were given 2 years by the electorate, really, to come up with this pledge and reduce immigration from, the wild numbers of 100,000 a year. It's now 1.4 million, by the way. Under 13 years later, under a Tory government, it's now 1.4 million. But the scandal that was 200,000 people in a year, David Cameron promised tens of thousands. The only reason it wasn't a vote winner is because they didn't believe him. If they actually believed he was going to ship them all back, he would have got hundreds of seats of majority.
That was also the election where UKIP saw a massive... I mean, basically that 47% that dropped to whatever, 20-odd%, that was basically the UKIP effect.
It was, yes.
And then you've got the
last paragraph of this, despite 80%, despite those staggering numbers, it's the most, basically ship them all back was the most popular political project in Britain at that point. 80% of people basically agreed that we should shut the borders and reduce immigration to zero. And this is the head of YouGov's kind of takeaway from it. He says, Here's a novel suggestion. All three main parties should stop worrying about what voters think about immigration. It's a pollster. Instead, they should work out what is right for Britain, for its economy, its society. Value-free analysis. They should do this honestly and openly, admitting that the task is complex, that the problems are real, and
The problems are real.
and will take time to solve. This is very kind of soothing people. It's very cooling off the mark, and it's very bureaucracy, take time, bureaucracy complex.
They should stop chasing voters who hold fierce and simple views on the issue, on either side.
Well, apparently there isn't another side, because 80% of people want the borders shut completely.
Their votes are either locked up or lost. What the voters who have yet to make up their minds are looking for are parties and leaders with the right character. On this, as on so many other things, authenticity and moral courage tends to be more attractive than cowardice and self-cynical populism. So his argument here is, because the government has said they were going to lower immigration once and didn't do it, it is forever a false hope.
Yes. He's basically... this is a conclusion of a performative failure exercise. He's saying that, well, the public wanted it, the government can't deliver it, we should abandon it.
David Cameron said he was going to do it over the space of 2 years, and he didn't.
The neutral, moral, and right decision from the gears of government is that immigration should continue unhindered, because that is the right thing to do. And when the electorate doesn't believe that you should do the right thing, you are virtuous in disregarding them. That is what, ahead of YouGov, the largest...
Scroll up to the second to last paragraph. Yeah. Something similar may be happening now. Most voters like what the government says it wants to do, but they don't think it is keeping its promise. Every reminder of the issue provokes criticism of failure more than praise of intent.
Yep.
And each commitment to do better risks sounding like a confidence trick than a genuine pledge.
The language on display here is so brazen, though. He's trying to pull a sleight of hand by saying, well, just because that they don't believe him, it means that the project is doomed.
And see, there is like a double sort of effect to show here as well, because as AA's pointed out on Twitter, and we're not going to fully go into it, but the previous administration, before Cameron Clegg and the ignoring Gordon Brown in the middle, Tony Blair's government actually did deport quite a number of people.
It did, yes.
I mean, it let loads in at the same time, of course, but he did actually deport people. As far as I can tell, under the Tory government, that has essentially stopped.
Well, the current situation is this, in that... have I not opened that one? I must have missed one. There we go. Here's a quick Bloomberg article reminding people on the reality in that UK doubles visas for residents despite aim to cut immigration. We went from a promise of tens of thousands that failed, but it's okay it failed because immigration can't stop, because immigration's the right thing to do, no matter what the electorate thinks. But here we are in 2023. Immigration, they admit that there's this period of exception between 2019 and 2022, which makes figures basically not work, because there's this period in which we are in the lockdowns exception, and nothing makes sense within these numbers, and they just kind of nix that. But they say from 2019 to 2022 the number doubles, and that you end up with 1.4 million visas.
Yeah, that's the number doubles for the year of 2022.
Yes.
For 2021, it was also nearly almost 1 million people as well.
Yes, it was. It's not
because of the Hong Kong scheme, which I thought was fucking nonsense. There's no way they brought actual folk over for fucking Hong Kong.
No way.
Is it just folk arriving from Africa with bloody Hong Kong paperwork?
A lot of it will be just Chinese.
Yes, sir. My name is Gui Long Bai.
But you see here that these are presented as like normal numbers. Like
half a million a year.
500,000 people a year since 2012 is considered normal numbers, when what was promised was tens of thousands of people. And then you have, there was a slight drop, and now we're up at the 1.4 million mark. But here's really what performative failure does. It fatigues people. People become disillusioned with the issue, as YouGov was describing, and that is the entire point.
Yes.
That things that mattered politically to people stop mattering because they assume that it is a lost cause.
Yeah, look at it backwards.
Yeah.
It's not that they aren't doing it because the people are dissuaded. They aren't doing it because they want the people to be dissuaded.
Yes.
And if they keep pretending that they can't do it, in theory, the people will become more and more dissuaded to the point where they just become wholly apathetic.
Well, it's very evident that there is a process of performative failure going on with the current regime. The current focus is small boats, Rwanda, and hotels.
Illegal immigration.
Yeah, but here we have foreign policy, who is trying to really bolster Rishi Sunak in this article. Rishi Sunak's government is anti-asylum. The British Prime Minister is pushing a new law that could effectively make it impossible to protect refugees. This is being written about a government that has just granted 1.4 million visas. And they are a government that's being portrayed as anti-asylum. And they're being portrayed as anti-asylum not because that would be unpopular, but because it would be popular. This energizes the right people. It gives excuses to the activists, as we'll get into later, that are the ones who undertake kind of some of the sharp end of the emergency performative failure, let's say. But this really is an appeal, I think, to right-wing people. You can see a lot of the leftist coverage as being a way to shore up the idea.
It paint him as the heel.
Yes. That paints him as the leftist heel and therefore the right-wing hero.
Yes.
It's the way it's always worked. But they talk about, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is now made it official that one of his top priorities is to pass a law that effectively bans people escaping conflict, persecution, or famine. It's the whole thing about the Stop the Boats bill, which was a false focus in general.
Look at. I can see the thing already, though.
Yeah.
His government's illegal immigration bill says that anyone who enters the United Kingdom through an illegal route will be detained and swiftly deported to a safe country. What if they just make the channel a legal route?
Yeah. Well,
what if they just have an amnesty and say, as long as you come from France, it's okay?
Well, this is a laser focus on channel crossings, specifically in boats, and those, I believe, only accounted for about 40,000. And that, again, we don't know what the illegal immigration number is. Some people say it probably approaches 1 million, but it doesn't really matter because this completely bypasses talking about the 1.4 million visas that were granted.
Well, it also means that they're not talking about the actual problem to some extent, because the only people that really could be charged or deported under this would be someone who willingly, under their own power, transported themselves illegally into the country.
Yes.
However, if you arrive at Dover in the back of a lorry and you go, I was human trafficked, I'm a victim, now it's a completely different situation and the government has to treat you as a totally different entity than the illegal migrant that you actually are.
Yes, that's true. There's all kinds of... It's the modern slavery bill they had to do.
Yes.
A compromise with, which means if you are instructed by an NGO like Care for Calais, for example, or any of them, as we'll get to later, that are funded by the government, if you're given advice by them, you can say the right things to make sure you don't fall into this category. But here's another one. CNN, the UK pushed a new migrant law, slammed as racist, illegal, and unworkable. Those last two parts are actually likely true. I believe that even if it is passed, it will be destroyed and devoured and reshaped into something unrecognizable by the courts. It is a token gesture against a vector of immigration that is a very, very minor contribution to overall numbers, and is being done in a way that will deliberately fail. It is nibbling around the edges, and it will still fail.
And it will be another example held up as to why you can't stop immigration.
Well, here's another one. Afghan refugees face homelessness, and the UK plans say rights groups. We're getting onto the hotels part of it. What happens is, as you all know, if you keep up with the news cycle, the Tory government comes in, it puts up a stop the boat sign, and it says close the migrant hotels.
Yep.
It basically cuts the knees off the protesters, and that, by the way, it manufactured, and we basically have proof of that now because of policy decisions. But a lot of those anti-migrant hotel protests and a lot of the Stop the Boats protest coincided directly with this, this policy announcement. It seemed to be a way to make it look like they were picking up a grassroots narrative rather than manufacturing a narrative that will result in performative failure. But Afghan refugees face homelessness at the UK plans, says Rights Group. You also must see this. I know we don't think like this, but a large part of Middle England were told during, the evacuation of Afghanistan, during the airlifts of the brave interpreters, that these people were a group that we owed allegiance to.
Yes.
That they're like the Gurkhas. They're being portrayed in the same way that the Gurkhas were, and that these are foreign heroes who helped our forces.
It's one of the few times where the government, to a certain extent, put its hand up and said, "We buggered Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And that's you, the people's fault, because you voted for the government that did it.
Yeah.
Therefore, you've got to take them on your street."
Well, the whole point is, I don't like illegal immigration, but we have to
save those who saved your sons in Afghanistan. I mean, the sign's right there.
That's what I was going to say. We will be butchered. You can't send us back. Thing is, legally, you can't actually send people back to Afghanistan.
Well, because most of them probably aren't from there.
Yeah, that's the whole point. But no, Afghanistan is one of the countries where if you claim asylum from it, you will basically just be accepted. But this whole point is that, we can't close the migrant hotels because the Afghan, save those who saved your sons in Afghanistan. Those people will be put on the streets if we close the migrant hotels. Therefore, you're right. It's infinite loopholes and infinite corner cases.
It's inhumane because you have to come up with a permanent way for them to have residence before you come up with your plan for how you're going to deport them.
The biggest one, and the reason really that I formulated this was the Rwanda plan. The Rwanda plan is one of the, I'd say, most brazen attempts at concocting performative failure. It is so obvious it's supposed to fail that some members of the left-wing press have actually become
genuinely confused.
Are genuinely confused. Then some of them are pretending to be incensed by it, but there is also just a sense of, again, confusion that this is so ridiculous. It's so obviously not going to work that it really feels like the Conservatives campaigning for Labour.
Yes.
This is them playing up the fact that they are ineffective. They are deliberately putting on the clown wig and the nose, and they are deliberately doing pratfalls on the immigration issue. That's how extreme the Rwanda plan is. And the problem is, you'll see all kinds of people come on GB News, even stuff like the Lotus Eaters going, we need to protect the Rwanda plan, the Rwanda plan, the Rwanda plan, and it's such a political trap because, like with Brexit, you end up defending what has become both an unpopular and just embarrassing act of failure. You become, the cheerleaders of failure. And that's really what this is about.
I mean, can you remember the nonsense? They had the live footage of the plane in the runway in Heathrow that was meant to take the first load of them off, and then at the last moment, some sort of legal challenge came in that meant they couldn't go.
Well, there was a lot of court wrangling about it. I don't actually go through it here because I've got some other examples of that. But the legal wrangling over the Rwanda bill, the continuing legal wrangling, is going to be very expensive, and that's
I'm not sure who that is in the chat there, Mr. Webster, but you might want to be a bit more careful with your words.
I'm gonna give you a little time out there, my friend.
We're optics, my friend, optics.
That's for your own good. That's for the good of your account. What is the Rwanda asylum plan? The 5-year trial would see some asylum seekers sent to Rwanda on a one-way ticket to claim asylum there. They may be granted refugee status or stay in Rwanda. If not, they can apply to settle there on other grounds or seek asylum in a safe third country. Blah, blah, blah. Basically, it's talking about the migrant crossings, the amount of people this could affect is quite low. Is the Rwanda scheme legal? Opponents argue Rwanda is not a safe destination for asylum seekers, and the scheme breaks human rights laws. But in the High Court, the plan is now legal, and it does not breach the UN's Refugee Convention. But again, it's such a, on the face of it, stupid plan. Instead of deporting them back to France, where they just were.
Yeah, well, flights cannot take off to Rwanda while legal proceedings are still ongoing.
Yes.
These legal proceedings will never stop.
No asylum seeker has actually been sent to Rwanda so far. The first flight was scheduled to go in June 2018.
A year ago.
Yeah, but was cancelled after legal challenges. All of this is just, it's a clown show. It's meant to look silly. You are meant to look at this and go, this is silly. Why are we doing this? This isn't going to work. Well, if this is the plan for immigration control, well, I give up on immigration control. That's what you're supposed to think.
Mm.
And here's a incensed article from the Independent. Home Office admits spending 1.3 million fighting around the legal battles, and that cost is still rising. Again, no plane can take off as long as this is in the courts. This is an act of performative failure. They knew that this would happen. They knew that this was basically politically and legally impossible, and they undertook it as the most impossible option because it was never meant to succeed in the first place. And I believe that is extremely obvious in this case. But it isn't just the Rwanda plan. The Rwanda plan is, it is the icing on the cake. It is the clown shoes on the clown. But there's a lot more that happens here. There was 3 years ago, this happens in normal deportation proceedings. It's not reported on as much, but basically deporting anyone from the UK is impossible.
Yes.
It doesn't happen. And when it does happen, it is generally delayed by the courts, and then it is delayed by activist action. But here's one from February 2020. Appeal court gives 11th hour reprieve to detainees due to be sent to Jamaica. Court of Appeal orders Home Office not to remove anyone scheduled to be deported from 2 detention centres on a 6:30 a.m. flight. Do you want to know why they couldn't be deported?
The action was brought because there was been the court ordered the Home Office not to remove anyone scheduled to be deported from 2 detention centres near Heathrow on a 6:30 a.m. flight to Jamaica unless satisfied they had access to a functioning non-02 SIM card on or before February 3rd.
Non-02, that's weird. So basically they were arguing that they were given the wrong type of free SIM card.
The action was brought because there has been a problem with the O2 phone network in the Heathrow detention centres last month, meaning many detainees had been unable to exercise their legal right to contact lawyers. The Home Office tried to have the decision overturned, but the attempt failed just before 1 a.m. on Tuesday morning. If we go down there, Bella Sankey, Director of Detention Action, which brought the legal challenge, said, "We are delighted with this landmark decision, which is a victory for access to justice, fairness, and the rule of law."
There we go. The neutral. It's just, again, it's such a clown show that these people are arguing because maybe it could have even just been one of them who
had dodgy signal.
Yeah, had dodgy signal with their phone. That now a flight that is already costing thousands of pounds.
£169,000 per person. That's
Yes.
what they're saying for the Rwanda one, anyway.
It is, but it's a deportation proceedings. This is the point that we made, that any part of the bureaucracy can grind to a halt. And generally, as we saw with the lockdown, something that the bureaucracy wants to happen will happen with no legal oversight. In fact, there's an inquiry going, the COVID inquiry basically just went, yeah, no, nobody looked at any of this. We just did it.
I mean, this now means in certain situation, if you were to try and under the current legal structure in Britain, deport anyone, you now need to make sure they're provided with a phone before you deport them.
Well, here's the same flight.
Yeah.
This is the same, this flight, we are now in November 2021, and the flight has not taken off yet. Most detainees taken off deportation flight lists to Jamaica after activists block road, stop the plane protesters, lock themselves to pipes outside the detention centre. This is how silly it gets. But this, even when the process
Where
produces...
do you think the stop the plane protesters got their money from, though? Where did they get the information from to know that there was going to be these people in this sort of block waiting to be deported?
Well, the fact is that activists are given prior notice of deportations, so a handful of them can cause it to performatively fail, even after being approved by the courts.
Yes.
That's where all this comes from, really. We'll get to it in a little bit, but spoiler alert, the government has given more than $3 million in taxpayer cash to groups campaigning against Rwanda migrant plan, some of which are groups like this.
And that was one of the big ones there was the Care for Cali group, I believe, which directly went against some of these cases in a legal group and also funded some of the protests.
They have not directly funded Care for Calais, but a lot of the groups that they do fund share members with them.
Yes.
It's what we've been through before, that all of these activist networks are very porous. And you'll have somebody who is part of a government NGO by day and part of something like Extinction Rebellion by night. There's a huge porous network of
God,
professional activists.
I've noticed what they've tried to pull in one of the next Guardian one we've got there as well.
Well, there's also, like I said, there's just this one, which is just funny. But the other one here is Glasgow protesters rejoice as men freed after immigration van standoff.
Look at the actual web address though. Is Glasgow residents surround.
Yes.
So what, they're just pretending that the average person that lives in the south side of Glasgow gives a fuck about this stuff.
Yeah.
But I know for a fact, because I saw them do it on Twitter, that there were your stand up to racism, Glasgow Antifa, and all these people who literally said in big releases, you know, someone from the home office has tipped us off, X person is going to be deported from this street, we're going to turn up, barricade the vans, and basically make it impossible for police officers to go in and remove them.
This was a very obvious act of government-led performative failure. This is something that was stage managed.
Yes.
It was very clear if you look at the footage, it was very clear about the events. This is not what actual deportation proceedings look like. They are generally taken in the dead of night. They are bungled into unmarked vans. They are taken to airports. They effectively do the extraordinary rendition playbook. If the government wants to put someone on a plane, as we've seen,
no one knows about
they can do.
Yeah.
And if the government wants to put someone on a plane and send them to somewhere where they'll be tortured, they very much can do that. And they do it en masse. They do it.
It's what Guantanamo Bay is for.
Yeah. That's what Syria used to be for. That's now what some parts of China are actually for. I need to do something on that at some point about weird Chinese black sites the West uses. Because that's a very good tip that we aren't actually their enemy. But I'll return to this one again. A leading think tank has questioned why the government has been using taxpayer cash to fund groups lobbying against its own flagship policy. Government, who is the think tank then? Of the Refugee Council wrote a damning letter.
New data from the think tank Taxpayers Alliance, which I know fair well is festooned with anti-wokeists and what I will refer to from now on as the based sprogs. And I've seen them all over bloody Twitter, so not good as far as I'm concerned.
No, but this is them. This is almost like ritual humiliation. This is them just kind of admitting it because it is quite out there in the open. But yeah, we said we've joined 150 organisations calling for the Prime Minister and Home Secretary to scrap their unthinkably cruel plan to ship people seeking refuge to Rwanda. Instead, they must create humane and effective solution to protect refugees. And it's, again, the Refugee Council, the first signature letter, was awarded $1.5 million in the 2021-2022 fiscal year by the UK government.
Yeah.
That's partially where I got this. That's where I got the thumbnail image from. But it's a much better version than that.
8 other charities also received funding despite the vocal opposition to the government. The Medill Trust, Pickwell Foundation, Disability Rights UK, Advanced NI, Race Equality Foundation, Asylum Welcome, Helen Bamber Foundation, and the Citizens of the World Choir. In total, the government gave $3 million in taxpayer cash to its own critics. So it funds the anti-migrant protests and it funds the pro-migrant protests. Because in all, having both of these things exist in conflict and make it look like there's more complexity going on is a fantastic way to manufacture apathetic consent.
Yes, it's also a great way to manufacture a conversation where they're talking about deporting people in a convoluted way to Rwanda, rather than just stopping. You can just stop awarding visas. You can just get rid of people. You can just imprison people who are here illegally. You can just detain them. You can just turn them around. It has worked in the past. And we have had mass transit for a very long time. It's very obvious that this is not impossible. But the next part of this is that there is, of course, a compromise waiting in the wings. And these measures will be designed to temper the supposedly extreme actions that will performatively fail. The deportations to Rwanda are not only them putting clown shoes on the immigration issue, they have also put up some bones. They are compromising, they are engaging in the protests and saying, well, we're making new legal routes for refugees.
And there is your answer to the previous thing we learned.
Yes.
They're going to ban the illegal routes. If the route from France to here is made legal,
yes,
overnight, the whole thing becomes useless.
Ministers are preparing to propose a new safe and legal route for up to 20,000 refugees coming to the UK next year in a major concession to Tory rebels. Weird. Who are these Tory rebels? What think tanks are they funded by? Find out later. Find out next week, actually.
Yes.
The government is understood to be ready to spell out the routes within 6 months for its illegal migration bill becoming law that will take the first refugees in the subsequent year. The new safe and legal routes will be additional to those already agreed for refugees from Ukraine, Hong Kong, Syria, and Afghanistan. So they're not even tacking it onto the existing programs. This is a brand new program.
Do you not think the name and the way they say it is interesting?
Yeah.
It's literally called the Illegal Migration Bill.
It's the illegal migration bill that will increase So
But it's just to read that illegal migration bill to me sounds like a migration bill that, by our own system of law, is illegal.
The moves are expected to set out an amendments on Thursday to the bill, which is due to return to the Commons. Delay, blah blah blah, and announcing any new routes until he had got a grip on the illegal migration through the government's plans to detain any migrants arriving illegally in the UK and swift their deportment to their home country or a safe third country such as Rwanda. Do I get this? Look at it's channel migrants. Number of migrants entering the UK per year. That's from the channel.
And where did the other 1,450,000 of them come from then if they didn't come across the channel?
They were just granted visas. It's such... Once you realise how the conversation's being crafted, it becomes so patently obvious, but it just isn't in the news cycle. Just under 500,000 people come to the UK come to the UK under safe and legal routes between 2015 and last December, according to Home Office figures. This includes 200, blah, blah. So there's a separate safe and legal route exists for refugees fleeing from Afghanistan, which aims to settle 20,000. Ministers also considering concessions over the detention of child migrants, aged under 18, which would mean the Home Office would have to secure permission from a court to hold them for longer than 72. That basically just says if you're a migrant, you say under 18, and you're just released into the wild.
Yep. MPs are demanding the government introduce a measure that would prevent the European Court of Human Rights from granting injunctions that ground migrant deportation flights, known as Rule 39 orders.
It's funny that the European Court of Human Rights can still do that. It's almost like they are still the overriding court because all our legislation comes from Europe because of regulatory alignment.
That sounds like MPs goading someone into making a massive career mistake, because it was said in the bottom of the previous article we're reading, it was like, so Suella Braverman hints that she's going to put the European Court back in its place.
Yeah.
No, you're not, love. Because
yeah,
that's just a trap to walk into.
The Strasbourg court granted an injunction to suspend the first scheduled deportation flight to Rwanda at the 11th hour last June. Here we go again. A performative failure. It's the whole thing that, well, we have to let in 20,000 more migrants legally, otherwise our meaningless bill will fail, because the European Court of Human Rights will prevent us from securing our borders, even though we are now supposing in post-Brexit.
Freedom is having the right SIM card.
Yes, freedom is having the correct SIM card. Here's another one, though, and this is one that kind of leads me into one of our last little points, is that you end up as well with a narrative being crafted where you have these canned solutions, as I call them. You have all these acts of performative failure, but once all of the options that you don't want to happen have failed, you propose something that you don't want to fail. And this has been framed as they're removing protections for migrants. Sometimes it's a compromise, like we saw above. Sometimes it's a stopgap and a supposed temporary measure, like this one is. But what this really does is we could almost have called one of our streams the Infinite Migrant Centre, in that this, like we talked about with Serco, allows most properties in the UK to become possibly migrant housing.
Yep.
It allows them to establish homes of multiple occupancy, allows them to put more of them in each house. It effectively expands the permanent housing of asylum seekers in the UK, and it's being jacketed as a loss of rights. And this is really the solution, from the hotels to the stop the boats to all of the Rwanda stuff. Once everything has performatively failed, they go, well, these people are here. You don't live in hotels, so we're going to have to put them in permanent housing. And by the way, the permanent housing is on your street.
Well, as we pointed out earlier on, they have already made it very clear that if you want to deport them, you have to come up with a permanent plan for residence in the interim. And what will happen is we will just forever exist in the interim.
Yes, these have all been stopgaps. In fact, the entire way migrant detention works, and the entire way it works while their cases are being heard, because there's a constant backlog, which, by the way, is always growing, it's never shrinking.
Yes.
So many of these people will never have their cases heard. The way it works is in the 5 to 6 years it can take for some of these people to have their cases heard, they can make the argument they've now put down roots in the UK.
They've got children.
Yeah.
They have a job. Maybe some of them use that as an excuse, or they have some sort of underlying health problem.
Yes.
Whatever it is that they can put forward, or that they've come round to a change in faith, and if they were to be moved back to their home country, they would be ostracised.
Oh, the classic, which is I'm a homosexual. But
yes.
That seems to always work. You're being deported. Jumps off table. I'm gay.
I am what I am.
Well, the last one I wanted to bring up is kind of a non-political one. It's something I've noticed in the construction industry. And it's
Tom Harwood and Darren Grimes screaming at the top of their lungs, build more homes.
It's the
concrete it all.
Well, it's the cladding crisis, which has been folded into the narrative of, improving UK housing. But this has been a relatively popular, I would say, political project, which is trying to get people into more fit housing. And I believe it's genuinely one where the politicians, at least, would like this problem to go away.
But I'm sure by fit housing, what they mean is more dense housing.
Yes. But I think this is a good example of we can't be bothered, so it's impossible. There's a lot of performative failure going on here from the government, insurers, lenders, the freeholders of the buildings, and the construction industry, because no one really wants to be left holding the bag, because this is quite a complex problem. And when it comes to light that a lot of the housing that has been built in the last 20 years to house largely these migrants, a large part of it is not fit for purpose now, because they've discovered that some of the fads of previous years that made buildings cheaper made them less safe.
So instead of having like the scheme built proposal for housing in the 50s, where they built all these horrible concrete things that then fell apart in about a decade and you had to move everyone else into new tower blocks, they're now going to have a scheme-built housing situation just for migrants alone.
Well, it's not just migrants. A lot of these, unfortunately, if this was public housing, it'd be sorted a lot faster.
Yeah.
The reason this has not been sorted is that these people have mortgages. These people own these flats. If this was social housing, they wouldn't legally be allowed to put them there. But because these people are homeowners and because they have been the ones left holding the bag, it's not a hard thing to remedy. It's not a difficult thing to remedy. The solution is, of course, to remove the cladding, which would cost money, and they're trying to decide who's going to pay for it, or it is to knock the buildings down and build something else.
Yes.
Or it would be to compensate these people, to give these people the full value of their flats. Say, we're very sorry, you can't sell it, you can choose to live here or not to live here, but basically here's compensation. That could be done very quickly. This is people in the tens of thousands, but it isn't people in the millions, and it's not amounts in the millions either. It would be an amount of maybe like £10 million this would cost. Maybe a bit more, some say up to 100 million.
It's just a government programme, it's always going to cost more than...
It's a lot less than was put into, say, the pension industry in a single day, which was 60 billion. 60 billion can be found in half a day to shore up public sector pensions, but 100 million can't be found to effectively prevent 17 more Grenfells, in quotes. Yeah. That's the scare story that's been put forward by some people. But the reality is that there are a large amount of private flat owners put in limbo, and the situation, even though it is remediable, has fallen victim to I consider a kind of a neutral, or at least politically neutral example, outside of party politics, performative failure, in that no one seems to be able to offer these people a solution, despite everyone agreeing that they should be offered one.
Yeah, and I think there's an important aspect as well here that we can really sum up with, which is a sort of compounding effect of one failure upon another to patch up the previous failure.
Yeah.
The unwillingness to curtail migration in any form at all has created a housing problem. The solution, of course, is to build more houses, orientating resources, time and money, which we know in real terms are dwindling rapidly, away from other uses that should otherwise be served. In a sense, one can imagine that the last productive work left in the UK will be the provision of housing to foreigners.
Unfortunately, it does seem to be the case. That's a large part of what the construction industry is now
think
doing.
Of so many things, how many inherent problems the NHS creates within our society that then must be otherwise solved by other failing policies.
Well, I guess we've got 10 more minutes. We tend to try and keep this to an hour and a half, in case you don't know. But the big point is that the way that all of this is set up is that, yes, there are things that are done with a large amount of malice. There are things that are done as these headline acts of performative failure. But it's set up to do those in a way that without the collective political will of the British elite class, things do not get done.
No.
And because they do not have omniscience, they aren't particularly efficient, they aren't particularly effective when it comes to things that aren't in their own interest, this allows the decay. This causes the decay. This is what allows blind spots for them to become ignored, because they are effectively acting like an omnipotent king in some ways.
Yes.
They are disallowing the function of government without their express say-so, because without their intervention, it doesn't function as we see. But there are so many areas that are left by the wayside. That's why I mentioned the cladding crisis stuff, that you end up with all of this breakdown, all of this decay, but because without concerted effort, an agreement from the crust of the British ruling elite, nothing gets done.
It's very strange. It is both on one hand self-serving, but also masochistic.
It's in the long-term self-defeating.
And it is how you end up, and one of the only ways that you end up with something like multi-ethnic conflict across otherwise peaceful English towns and cities becoming the pragmatic solution for how we run our economy.
Yes.
Multi-ethnic conflict and the mass rape of women across Britain is just the price we pay to make sure that we can afford the pension bill.
Well, it's something that people always point out, but you can create a situation in which the government is paying the wages of everyone in Britain, and yet maybe 10,000 people stuck in limbo can't be offered houses that aren't death traps. A lot of people always point this out with their pet issue, but they never see the greater picture, which is the institutions they put faith in do not operate without the express consent of those in power. And those in power are not just the politicians, because some of them are power brokers, but they are the ruling elite and increasingly the global elite. And their attention is not unlimited. And by creating a situation in which there aren't these independent bodies, i.e. private industry, in which they don't have their hands in all the cookie jars, all of it is deliberately paralyzed because, power can't be broken. And iron law of oligarchy, all of that stuff. All of that leads into a situation where no one can operate without express permission. You have these instances of performative failure, but your default is just failure.
Yes.
The default of bureaucracy is failure.
You can only have success within the consensus.
Yes, and the consensus is tightly controlled, and it is tightly controlled to serve the interests of the ruling elite. But those conflict with reality because they are not omniscient and they are not omnipotent. And that is the great kind of divide that we describe when we talk about the fact that at some point there is a collapse coming. And performative failure is one of the most perverse aspects of that, because it is deliberate suffering, as we described with the whole Brexit stuff, for a political purpose to deceive people. It is one of the more insidious aspects of how a managerial state can operate. And if you have a brain in your head, you can see the incentives. We haven't even gone over the incentive structure here, because the incentive structure is obvious.
Yes.
And if it's not obvious to you, I'd recommend you maybe look at some of our reading lists.
Go back a few years.
Yeah. Look at some of our reading lists. Maybe watch our democratization series. It should be very obvious that the bureaucratic class does not have interests that align with Britain and the British public, in quotes.
Because if it did, it wouldn't be in the position it is.
Yes, reality is evidence that is not true. Once again, I'd like to thank all of our members. I'd like to thank everyone who's donated. We had one more, I think, via PayPal.
I believe that might have been Not Sure. He did mention in the chat.
Yes, thank you. I was going to make sure I get right at the end. Thank you, Not Sure, for the PayPal donation there. The PayPal app has crashed. But I will make sure it gets read. Just give me a second here. There we go. Something went wrong. Please try again later. God, I hate this stuff. Consultancy. Thank you very keep up the great analysis. Keep growing, inshallah. Thank you very, very much for the £20 there. And thank you for avoiding the Google tax. That's quite useful. The easiest way to help us, though, is to interact with the videos. Do your algorithms, dances. Yes. Do leave a like.
Al Gore sure got that rhythm.
Also just, I think this is one of our more digestible streams. So if you have someone who you think might like this, or if you think someone just might be shocked by it, do give it a share. We do rely on that. When I'm not on Twitter anymore. You've been horrendously suppressed on social media. So we don't really have that many
I did notice
outlets.
Actually when I said last week to people, just go retweet everything I've tweeted, that'll help. One person did actually go through and retweet about 20 odd. So
thank you.
Whoever that was, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, guys. I don't think we have much else to shill apart from the Substack, which I will quickly get up on screen there. Do go and read the Anti-Politics Substack, and of course your Carlisle,
which I believe to be an unbelievably important post, and one that I will basically natter on about for years until someone boxcars us.
There should be another large article going up on Thursday if I manage to get it into shape. We'll see, but there will be more coming on the Anti-Politics Substack.
There should also, hopefully, depending on what news we get about certain things, be some more noise about certain events that may or may not be happening in the UK.
Yes.
So, of course, as soon as we know what we're doing, and we have an idea of what we'd like to do, but we need to make sure things are going to line up first. We will let you all know, because we like to give people as advanced warning as possible. But thank you for joining us this evening, and I suppose have a good night.
Have a good night, guys. We'll see you guys on Wednesday.
You bloody bastard bitch! Fuck you! Bloody fucking mother bloody fuck bitch! Bloody fuck you fucking bloody bastard! Bench road bloody! You bloody!
No, but why?
Bloody no!
Why?
Bloody fucking!
If accident, then what you wanna do?
Why you fuck me? I fuck you bloody! Bloody bastard! Fucking running like lady, eh? Bloody! What the fuck, man? Fucking now shout at me, innit? Why are you shouting at me?
Because I am going to the work, you don't do the other places.
Why are you shouting?
Because of this you are doing, so I don't know you are doing like this. I think you are going to accident.
No, shouting at me no good, man. Me no shout at you.
But the thing is that, what you think if you do like this one, you are going at work and somebody else.
But that like one, if you running like that one, you gonna fucking fall, innit? But hurting yourself.
But yeah, because of this I saved myself.
That one very icy road, man. Okay, have a nice day. Bye-bye.